Kia ora everybody and welcome from around the world. It's really fantastic to have all of you here. Look, we know there are many examples of evidence-based policing excellence around the world. I mean, looking at the United Kingdom, partnerships between police constabularies and local universities. I personally love the work being done by Katie Barrow-Grint in Thames Valley, very focused on practical, tangible examples of EBP for frontline practitioners. University College London, where I'm a visiting professor and teach annually, has promoted POP through Nick Tilley, Aidan Sidebottom and my very good friend Gloria Laycock. In Australia, Lorraine's leadership at the University of Queensland has been absolutely inspirational in its support for EBP, and I just want to say that Lorraine came to New Zealand in 2015 and 16 when I was struggling actually to convince people of the value of an evidence-based approach, and she gave me really fantastic support with the previous police leadership here, and it made a massive difference to the ability of New Zealand Police to shove this idea in the right direction, I have to say. So Lorraine, thank you for that particularly. And of course in the US, Renee is an acknowledged expert and global leader in research and EBP through her work at RTI International. So and we have John here from Canada, and John, you're very welcome, and we know that there's some great work going on in Canada too. We also know that success isn't guaranteed. In Western Australia, for example, after promising early beginnings, it's probably fair to say that EBP has faded and one would argue possibly failed. And maybe for all of us here, it's important to understand what the reasons are for that. While it's easy to blame others for a lack of understanding, we probably also need to examine ourselves so that we learn from the past and see how we can all do collectively better. So look, to get the discussion underway, I thought we would ask each of the panel to respond to a question. And the first question I think we'll put to the panel: what does policing need to do in order to adopt, embed, or I guess in some cases sustain an evidence-based approach into everyday policing? So we might ask each panel member in turn to address that question. We might start with you, Renee, if that's acceptable. What do we need to do to embed EBP?
So my suggestion would be, I think the place to start embedding EBP would be really to go through your policies and practices and create some type of matrix and use that against what we know as far as like what works and what doesn't in policing. And I know sometimes, people say, well, we're not sure what works or what doesn't work, but I think there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of books nowadays, actually, over the last couple of years about evidence-based policing and evidence-based practices that you could use that show you, what works and what doesn't. And then there's hints about the things that we think will work. There's also evidence-based practices within, the psychology field and other fields that we could bring into policing. But I think the place to really start is to examine your practices, your policies, and put those up against what we know works and doesn't work. And then from there, look at what you're doing out in the field. Because I know we always have policies, but then how we implement those policies in the field and what they look like if nobody's overseeing them or making sure that they're being implemented as written, you might not be getting the results that you thought you might be getting. And then also test out those practices. Because I think that's the biggest thing that people also miss is they misunderstand that evidence-based policing isn't being data-driven. So it's not just using data to drive your practices in the field, it's also testing out whether those practices work. And that's pretty clear. What I've been seeing, when you read the literature about people saying, when you're looking at whether things work or don't work, you have to test it within your city or organization to make sure that those findings also work your area. So those would be the two things that where I would start if I was trying to embed it in an organization.
I think that point about context is really important, Renee, and I absolutely agree with that. All interventions are context specific, and lifting things that work in one place and assuming it will work in the same way elsewhere is something we've all learned, I think, doesn't really work. Alex, we might come to you next. Welcome.
Thanks. Well, thanks. It's really nice to be here, and amazing what you guys are doing in New Zealand. I think the world looks on in quite a jealous way. Yeah, I'm really positive about the future of evidence-based policing. In the same way that now no one would ever even think that medicine should not be evidence-based, I'm sure it will be the same for policing. So it won't be, I don't think, hopefully a thing in perhaps a decade or so, because it will be accepted as the way forward. I'm just listening to Radio 4 today about how the Treasury has changed how they fund things. So there used to be just concern around how efficient you are and how much money you wanted, but now they're much more interested in inputs, outputs, and outcomes. And I think the way to inculcate evidence-based policing into a policing organisation is to present it as it is, which is a driver of effectiveness, something that looks forward and drives innovation, drives efficiency at the same time, and helps us to be more effective. It's not something driven by a university or a personality or an individual. It's a way of operating that must be at the forefront of policing as we go forward. There's sort of no option, really. And I'm just thinking, you know, with the advent of no-code machine learning, for example, this is something that evidence-based policing practitioners can use now to say, which offenders should I focus on? Which victims should I focus on? You know, who is most likely to be the corrupt cop? You know, data can tell us this stuff. And then, as Renee said, we can start testing more religiously. And then something we've been doing in London quite a lot is trying to improve how we track what our staff are doing to make sure that they are doing what we know is effective. And perhaps the final thing I'll say is it might be time for evidence-based policing to just subtly move on from the big beasts of evidence-based policing like hotspots or focused deterrence or problem solving. These are really effective tactics. And they're so effective, in actual fact, a lot of police just ignore them still, which is heartbreaking. But, you know, we need to push into some of those more data-driven concepts where we understand where we should focus our efforts. And then when we're looking at how we intervene, how do we test more effectively? Thank you.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks for your leadership over many years in this space, I have to say. We might head to Canada next. John, you're very welcome. How do we embed EBP?
Thanks so much for your time. I would suggest a few points. The first is that EBP needs to be physically and culturally integrated into routine policing at all levels and not just for leadership. I also would stress that language is important. So we all know about the art of policing and the value of experience, but I'm not 100% confident that there's wide recognition that the scientific process can benefit our understanding of effective police practices, that everyone understands that. And I believe that police science needs to be recognized as a legitimate and authoritative source of police knowledge. We also need to work towards demystifying any hesitancy about the reliability and applicability of research findings for policing. And to have EBP to be more mainstream, I would take the conversation outside of our familiar bubbles. And when we're speaking about what works in policing, we need to ask for whom. So Jack Kozierski and Dr. Laura Huey, who is CANCEP's founder, pointed out the importance of co-generating research between academia, police, and community members, therefore extending our understanding of effective police practices in the communities. And lastly, when we spread the message about EBP, we need to be clear about what it is and what it isn't. Again, from Jack and from Dr. Laura Huey, they suggest that research supporting a particular practice doesn't mean that the practice is evidence-based, as there are varying levels of quality of research. And secondly, that the evidence based in EBP must not just be from a handful of studies, but rather that such findings can be replicated in different settings.
Thank you, John. We've actually heard quite a lot in the last day or so around community engagement in police research, and I do think it's an interesting and valid area that actually here in New Zealand we're pushing quite hard into. So I thank you for that, those observations, John. Jonathan, welcome from Singapore.
Thank you. Well, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I have really enjoyed the last 24 hours, some fantastic speakers that I'll refer to later. But I will add my comments to what Alex has said, that I'm privileged to kind of move around the world via Zoom calls, but certainly I meet police officers all around the world, and the evidence-based policing center of gravity really is in your hands, actually, Mark and team. And I applaud the way that you have steered your leadership, political and otherwise, to where I think we should be modeling across the world, which is, having spent 30 years kind of swimming against the tide in a vicious culture that doesn't really like change. Policing needs people with a strong political antenna to say to their political masters that, you spend 1% of GDP on average across the Anglosphere on policing. You need, as in the UK yesterday during their debate on their budget, you need to show value at a time when you're probably likely to face austerity. And I think it was Professor Sherman a few months ago that said, where evidence-based policing has gained traction, it is where financial austerity is fighting against public spending. So I think fiscally, there's some really important issues for police ministers, prime ministers, and others. But it's a top-down, bottom-up, inside-out, but vitally outside-in approach. And I say that because civil society organisations, your critical friends, of which I've been introduced as a critical friend, I'd say that they really are critical stakeholders in driving evidence-based policy and practice. Last year, we heard, after the tragic events of the murder of George Floyd, a defund narrative. And I would say that defunding actually won the support of some critical friends. The leaders of some of the police unions said, now is the time for us to say we should be doing less with more. And I think evidence-based practice and policy that we can bring in from pharma, from medicine, and from other disciplines will help drive the top-line political discussions. And I will say this as an advocate for the role of civil society, and I'll say this throughout discussions, we need to make our customers more intelligent customers of policing and empower them to ensure that evidence-based policy and practice is at the heart of everything that we do in law enforcement and government service. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I think the idea of less with more would have a good deal of appeal for many police leaders. So thank you for that observation. We'll run with that, I think, as an idea. Look, lastly, and welcome back to the President of the Australian New Zealand Society, Dave Cowan. Dave, you're very welcome here as the host of this conference. We'd be delighted for you to finish this section off with your reflections on the question.
Thanks, Mark. I was thinking about the basic position of developing a research culture within policing. It doesn't start with the technicalities of methodologies in research. It starts with how police view research. And Dr. Jeffrey Barnes, who works with the Met and has worked elsewhere around the world, he simply says the chief of police, as they're called in America, or the commissioner, really needs to give this about 10 minutes of their time and to say to their 10 top command staff, hey, have you got any evidence-based partnerships, collaborations with academia happening? Have you got any trials running? Have you got any big data analysis? And have that discussion. And you'll see in a hierarchical organisation that little nudge will flow through the organisation, and it starts at the top. But I'm also positive, about the future. In my presentation in August, I sort of reflected on, nurses in the 1950s and earlier were seen as bed changers. Ambulance officers were seen as stretcher carriers. Evidence-based practice has professionalised those domains, and policing is not the same. I think it's a bit hard not to be evidence-based. You can't say that you're not evidence-based. That's a double negative, but you know what I mean. And I think, what Jonathan touched on, the collaborations are really important. There's a lot of rhetoric, and there's a lot of people who just get with the culture in policing. Academia brings a different view. They're not constrained by pips on shoulders. They can provide police with really valuable insights. And we need to value not only research, we need to value those collaborations. Even this morning on the way to work, I got a call from an academic friend of mine, Justin Reedy from Griffith University in Queensland. And we were talking about how we can use body-worn camera and code that and understand what are the civilising effects of police behaviour when they interact with the public, what things really inflame situations. So I think the research culture, the collaborations are so important. And I think we need to look at the New Zealand example, because that's what you've modelled. That is exactly what you've modelled to get rubber on the road. And my saying is, nothing succeeds like success. You need to get some wins on the board, and then people come along. But the other point is that you've got to be prepared for a bit of pushback, because pushback is the symptom of people adapting to something new. And evidence-based policing does challenge police. But rather than see that pushback as a negative, that is the process that we need to go through in order that little bit of our DNA changes and wants to be more involved in EBP, sees the value in research. And I think if we look to New Zealand and what you've achieved, I think there's a lot to be learned there. So, yeah.
Listen, thanks, Dave. And the whole pushback thing is a really important observation. It might seem, that we've made progress here. We're still getting pushback today with things we're trying to do. So don't assume that it's fixed at all, but I think we're on a journey. Listen, thanks, everybody. We're going to hand back to Julian.
Thank you, Mark. You're doing a great job, actually. Better than me. So, and to continue to reinforce the point, I'll now hand over to Lorraine, Professor Lorraine Mazerolle, to pose our next question to the panel. Kia ora, Lorraine.
Great. Thank you so much. And it's really great conversation so far, and it's great to see everyone from all over the world. So, look, if people that are listening didn't hear Larry Sherman's presentation this morning, I really would urge you to go back and have a look at that. I think that one of the things that Larry really said in his presentation is how important it is for the police not just to know the evidence, but actually to really understand the theories that are driving a lot of the interventions that might work. So my question to the panel is, how can we use both the theory and the evidence of legitimacy policing to build trust and confidence in policing?
Want me to come in there, Lorraine? Are we just shouting
Yes.
up? Or
Go for it.
Well, you're an inspiration here. And let's think of a couple of stories, right? Imagine a specialist firearms officer going through a door, balaclavaed up, mask, probably a chainsaw, or hydraulic ram going through, 4 a.m, BME, females there, kids there. They have to exert command and control immediately for the safety of everybody. So they might use flashbangs, probably not, a lot of shouting, a lot of domination. I think if a firearms officer in that circumstances knew the theory of what you taught in relation to the principles of procedural justice, treat people with dignity and respect, demonstrate your motivation is good, and listen. After they had done that, they would do this. They would kneel down next to the 9-year-old with their mum. They'd take their balaclava off. They would say, look, I am really sorry I've just had to do this. I know it's really scary, but the reason why we do it is this. Sometimes people have guns and they point it to us, and we have to make sure it's safe. But it is safe now, and thank you for your patience. Is there anything I can do to help you with? What they wouldn't do is walk out and leave it to the local police to mop up. Similarly, if I'm stopping and searching someone, I would say, you know, this is really important in London at the moment. I'm really sorry that I'm stopping and searching you now. The hardest part of my job is telling some mother that they've just lost their son to being stabbed. And I've got reason to believe that you may have a knife on you for these reasons. But thanks very much for helping me out. And by the way, is there anything else I can do to help you? Now, there are two instances, but they are built from the knowledge that you gave us through QSET, where you talk about positive breath tests and breath test examples. And I say that, so I don't want to talk theoretically, other than you can apply what you have pushed, Lorraine, to so many different circumstances for police interactions, right at the heart of building legitimacy. And final thing to say is I think all the evidence points to the thing that builds legitimacy the most is not the media, it's actually our interactions with the public and with both offenders and victims. And I think the evidence is quite strong on that. The majority of the variation that can be explained is explained by police behaviour. Thank you.
Yeah, great answer. So any of the other panel members, and I think one of the things that you really say so well there, Alex, is that it's not just knowing the evidence this might work, but it's actually understanding the why. And that's why the understanding the theory that sits in behind it is so important, because it means that the police can be adaptable to the different circumstances, and it doesn't need to be quite so prescriptive. So other panel members.
Yeah. Can I jump in, Lorraine?
Yeah.
I don't quote you every day. I'm talking about procedural justice, but there aren't many days. And in fact, I've written a white paper in conjunction with my company and Deloitte, and you're all over this. And the reason I mention it is I was very privileged. I was lucky enough to be the acting borough commander in Lambeth, which is about 1,400 staff. And I'd spent 9 years in what was described as Europe's most challenging policing environment. And the most important thing for me to bridge a very significant gap between a disenfranchised community that spoke 150 languages in about 12 square kilometers and the boys and girls in blue was to actually explain to community leaders, self-aggrandized community leaders and ordinary people that our job really was to help reduce serious and violent crime. And there is a power in the toolkit in England and Wales, section 60 of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act, which for many is a draconian power. But I just want to leap back to what Larry Sherman was saying and quoting earlier today, was on a couple of studies done in Kansas and other meta-analysis of some work of David Weisberg, which is in super violent hotspots, the community expects you to do something. And the mums of the young boys who are being stabbed and murdered were the critical friends of some of the most draconian powers that we used. And when I was working with, and I was fortunate to work with Sir Anthony Bottoms and Justice Tanakabe on procedural justice, we used this kind of modeling of speaking very clearly and transparently about some of those powers in the way that you and Alex mentioned in the drink drive interventions. So I think once you get some really legitimate evidence-based practice that you can share with hard to listen to communities, then you really are driving performance and ultimately, I think, closing that gap between the confidence gap between the communities that you serve and the police that are serving them.
Great, thank you. Anyone else from the panel? Do they want to?
Lorraine.
Yes.
So you mentioned criminological theory, right? Now, put PJ aside just for 1 minute. Criminological theory is really important. And as a police officer of 30 years, when I'm reading this stuff, I'm like, wow, that explains it so well. And we need to be better engaged in criminological theory because it opens up your thinking. And it's not hard, it's not scary. You can go, that one doesn't do it for me, I'm throwing it out, this one does. And just bringing it back to procedural justice, I mean, the theory on PJ is enlightening, and I encourage anyone listening to really look at Lorraine's work and the broader body of work out there, because it opens your eyes up. And procedural justice and the trust and confidence that the community have in police is at the heart of policing. We cannot take it for granted. We need to nurture that. We need to make sure that we're not eroding trust and confidence. And with Lorraine and Sarah Bennett's help, we ran a trial in Victoria here where we trained officers in the use of procedural justice in the midst of a pandemic lockdown to get them to use the pillars of PJ in their interactions with the community. And the survey returns were really impressive. They treated me with respect. They were trustworthy. They explained what they were doing. They didn't assume I was doing something wrong. All the pillars were in there. That was really enlightening. We overlaid it with the serious violence trial where we visited 500 violent offenders in their homes. We wanted to treat those people with respect and show them that we were authentic in wanting them, keeping them out of trouble. And now we're looking at applying it in a drug driving trial. So it goes through everything that we do. And it's so important that we look at that theory and apply it to some of the biggest challenges in policing, because it's the thing that's going to maintain our trust and confidence with the public going forward.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so Renee or Jonathan, did you want to make any comments? Renee, hi.
Yeah, hi, Lorraine. So one of the things that I was thinking about when it comes to criminological theory and procedural justice is when we understand theory and you understand the nuances of the theory, then you're actually better at applying it in the field. So often when procedural justice gets applied and people learn it like in an 8-hour course and they don't really get the full understanding of like the underlying theories, I've seen it applied where they think that it's just listening, you know, rather than having somebody's voice heard. And I think there's a very subtle and nuanced difference to listening to somebody in the field. And we do this in our relationships too, right? With our significant others, with our kids. And then we talk over them, or we invalidate their feelings, or we tell them why they're wrong. And if you watch people's reactions, especially in the field, being told by a governmental authority that their feelings are wrong, you know, you could watch somebody spin up really quickly. And I think that's part of why it's so important that people understand the theory underlying procedural justice, underlying the criminological theory, because when you're going out into the field and you're applying the evidence base to your practice, if you don't understand the nuance, you're going to immediately discard some of the research and the evidence-based practice because you'll think, you know, this doesn't work. But in actuality, it might be that you're just not applying the nuance in the field the way you should. And that's why I think also, you know, we still need a ton of research when it comes to the field of policing, because I think we haven't explored all of those nuances in the field and the way we can be more procedurally just and safer and accomplish the things we need to do in the field without resorting to a lot of the things that we do now. So I think it's hugely important that we understand the theory behind the work we do and how we apply it into the field.
Look, I think you've said it absolutely perfectly, Renee, and the other members on the panel. It's the understanding of why people are doing things. I'm going to hand it over to you now, Simon. I know you've got some questions.
Kia ora, thanks Lorraine. And I'd just like to say how brilliant it is to see all your wonderful faces on our big screen in the studio. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. All right, well, look, the last question, and we'll try and move through this quite quickly, is what's the one thing that you think societies can do in reframing the offer of evidence-based policing to embed it more widely into business as usual? Renee, I might start with you if that's okay.
I actually think if we were trying to embed this in policing more, I think that citizen advocates, your city councils, your government entities need to be doing exactly what I know Washington's done and I know other places have done, is to ask them, what the evidence base is for their policy and practices. Because too often here in the US, we have the media driving our police practices. They are really the ones that say, here's what police should be doing. And then there's media pressure to adopt new practices that we have no idea whether they work or don't work or are going to harm our public. And police chiefs have to adopt them. So I think if we were told through either law, through legislation, or within the city council that we're not going to be adopting practices unless we know that there's some research for them or some evidence base for them, I think it would go a lot further than just having what we have now, which is just a mishmash of all types of entities saying, here's what police should be doing, and whoever has the loudest voice wins.
Thanks, Renee. It's interesting, we've just gone through that here in New Zealand, actually, around the issue of general arming or not. Yeah, it's a good point. Alex, I'd like to come to you next, please.
Thanks. Well, I really don't like your question. Asking for just one thing is not fair. So I'm going to refuse to answer it. No, there's so many things. Well, I see there's this definition of policing that Bittner defined, which was it should be like a Florence Nightingale in pursuit of Willie Sutton, the American bank robber. And I see policing largely as a philanthropic exercise of, protecting those who are abused by the powerful, unnecessarily getting justice for victims. And if there's one thing we can do, I think it's reframe the debate around what is it we can all do. NGOs, people like Jonathan in SAS, some of the big corporates who are interested in corporate social responsibility, come together to say, how can we be evidence-based around being more philanthropic in our mission? We need to create a real movement. And I would say, ANZSEBP and the SEBPs around here, our mission is to use, communicate, and produce the best research evidence. And this thing about police leaders, what can we do with police leaders? We've been doing it for about 10 years now. We're talking to people who are becoming now the police leaders. So we need to keep on doing that, and hearts and minds all the time. People out there are really curious. Sometimes they know it, sometimes they don't. But when they suddenly see the evidence, they, oh God, now I get it. And we must keep that imagination and that innovation continually being pushed. Thanks. And by the way, Western Australia did some incredible research trials, some huge successes. I was lapping it all up here in the UK, thinking, God, they're pushing out amazing stuff. So back to that point made earlier, I don't know why that didn't happen, but it was like a beacon of industry for evidence-based practice. So I just thought I'd throw that big up to Western Australia.
Thanks, Al. I spent 3 years over in Western Australia, and yeah, the winds of political change had a big part to play there. I think what you were just saying is a real nod to the principles of policing by consent, and that often forgotten Peelian principle around an open and ready hand of friendship to everybody, no matter what their standing in society. Thanks, Al. Let's go over to Canada and John. John, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are about, it's echoing a lot of what everyone's already spoken about, but I would add in terms of the fact that we need to build an infrastructure for sustainability, including like long-term personnel and funding, specifically for SEBPs, and also developing a space for our next group of EBP leaders, and to give them a space where they can discuss and build on different ideas. And again, back to some of the points that others have discussed about facilitating and building local research and disseminating those findings, and about partnering with local community groups and hiring, and those groups that are hiring police leaderships to ensure that the work that we're doing is accountable and transparent. And I would echo exactly what Renee had mentioned in terms of educating our police boards, our community members, our city councils about what are effective police practices, because they're ultimately the bridge between our communities and our police agencies.
Thanks, John. I think that really plays to some of the themes that have come throughout over the course of the conference, actually, around making sure we're doing things together in partnership with the community, not to the community. Same applies to us, right? Let's go over to Singapore. Jonathan.
Thank you. Well, I'll give a slightly different view, but I do echo what I've heard from all of the panel. There does need to be political buy-in, and I'm talking about big P here as well. But policing, in my view, and I've spent kind of 36 years hanging around policing now, is event-led. And I think the events that I'm talking about over the course of my 36 years brought in primary legislation for policing to meet with their communities under the 1984 Police and Criminal Evidence Act. And 15 years later, primary legislation under the Crime and Disorder Act of 1999 for police to work in partnership with joint plans. And I'm a great believer in primary and actually subordinate legislation to drive through change. But I also want to seize on the tragic events that have taken place in Christchurch, for example, and the work that I've seen big tech do, that is Facebook, Twitter, and Google and others, in Prime Minister Ahern's call for action, the Christchurch call for action, saw a seismic change in the way that big tech worked. Up until that tragic event, there was no global internet forum for countering terror, where in real time hashtags were shared across many organizations that would be seen as competing organizations for the public good. Behind me is a biography of Jennifer Doudna, who won the Nobel Prize last year for chemistry, and the work that she did on CRISPR, which is why we all now have a very effective vaccine. Big Pharma and Stanford and Oxford and other universities weren't working collaboratively until they rallied around a seismic event, such as a pandemic, where everyone worked together. And I'm looking at tech, the industry that I'm representing on this, and thinking exactly why aren't big tech companies working together to help drive innovation, to upskill the academics and others in policing and law enforcement to drive a safer community. As I always say to my colleagues, and get dewy-eyed saying it, we are all stakeholders in making our communities safer, in identifying risk and reducing harm. And so for me, this is very much about using the other models that we've seen, the mental models that Renee mentions in her book and others, to drive innovation in a way that doesn't silo different elements. And I'd say there are 4 key pillars to driving innovation. That's the police, academia, private industry, and critically civil society organisations. Getting them firing all cylinders, working in partnership, I think will help drive from a niche business that is evidence-based policing to business as usual. And I'm really keen to make sure that industry helps drive that to that tipping point.
Thanks, JT. I think that point on collaboration, not just amongst the societies, but the societies, policing, community, and big business, big tech. I think that's a really exciting proposition. Last but not least, let's go to Dave Cowan. Dave, what are your thoughts?
Simon, I'll touch on what we talked about last night as we were regrouping on the conference, but fundamentally research, evidence-based policing is about questions. The origin of the word questions is quest, and that is an enduring journey. And I think that's what we're on. If you acknowledge that within the context of the social structures that we all exist in within our agency, across academia and the partnerships we have with community as well, it's actually about the connection that we have. And we talked about what has been referred to as the fourth T last night, the storytelling. In a world, and particularly in policing, where there's a lot of white noise coming at us, we've got to make sense of things quickly. It's the storytelling, not the emails, the storytelling that connects with people and brings them in to that enduring journey. So I think we need to be better at that. And I think the collective group of societies are really well positioned to maximise that connection at command level, with officers on the ground, right through to community and our partners. And I think that's one of the challenges that we need to rise to. It's not about the technicalities of research and the methodologies and all that. We need to engage with police with relevant research questions that will really help policing into the future.